You ever feel something shift before anyone says it out loud? Like the room gets colder, the smiles feel rehearsed, and suddenly you not the golden story anymore. You the problem. That what this felt like. One week I am filling arenas, breaking assist records, moving ratings in ways this league has never seen. The next week, my name isn't even on the rotation board. No explanation, no injury report, no statement, just silence, the kind of silence that isn't accidental, the kind that designed. People thought I disappeared. I didn't. I was erased, and that a very different thing. Let me tell you something. Players don't just vanish. Not when they re-healthy. Not when they reproducing. Not when they re-leading the team in assists, drawing double teams every possession, and driving national conversations about women basketball. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen because of rotation adjustments. That happens when someone somewhere decides your influence is getting too big to comfortably manage. At first, I didn't panic. I thought maybe it was temporary. Maybe it was rest. Maybe there was something happening internally I didn't know about. But when I walked into practice and saw my minutes reduced without conversation, when reporters started asking questions and nobody had real answers, when even teammates looked confused, that's when I knew. This wasn't odd basketball. This was control. Hear what people don't understand. When you grow fast, when your name becomes bigger than the system that houses you, it makes certain people uncomfortable. I didn't ask to become the face of ratings spikes. I didn't ask to sell out arenas on the road. I didn't ask for cameras to follow me into warm-ups. I just played the game the way we always played it. But growth changes power dynamics, and power does not like being challenged. Whispers started leaking. She is too outspoken. She questions marketing decisions. She wants the league to modernize, as if wanting the sport to grow is some kind of rebellion, as if believing fans deserve authenticity is a disrespect. I didn't break rules. I didn't skip practice. I didn't disrespect teammates. I asked questions, and sometimes that more dangerous than breaking rules. Then came the quiet benching. No announcement, no transparency, just reduced minutes and careful language. I watched games from the sideline knowing I could impact them. I watched analysts dance around the topic. I watched social media start to notice, and then something happened the league didn't expect. The fans didn't move on. They got louder. Where's Caitlin? Started trending. Every highlight show felt incomplete. Every broadcast that ignored the situation made it more obvious. When people love something, they protect it. And fans felt like something was being taken from them. That's when Sophie spoke. You don't sideline your biggest star unless you were scared of her power. That line didn't just trend. It detonated because it said what everyone was afraid to say. Lexi followed. If this can happen to Caitlin Clark, what will they do to the rest of us? Now, it wasn't about me. It was about every player. And that, when it became bigger than a benching. Inside locker rooms, conversations changed. Younger players started asking quiet questions. Veterans looked uneasy because deep down, everyone understood something uncomfortable. If visibility can be shrunk without explanation, if influence can be punished without clarity, then nobody is untouchable. I didn't ask Sophie or Lexi to defend me. They chose to, and when they did, the temperature in the league shifted overnight. This wasn't just a sports story anymore. It became a culture story, a power story, a control story. And the more the league stayed silent, the louder the questions became. Sponsors started calling. Media panels started speculating. NBA players started posting subtle support. And every hour without answers made it feel less like strategy and more like suppression. Let me be very clear. I love this league. I grew up dreaming about playing here. But loving something doesn't mean ignoring its flaws. Sometimes loving something means demanding it be better. The official statement finally came. Vague, corporate, strategic rotation decision. No details, no context, no accountability. When I stopped being confused and started understanding, when systems feel threatened, they don't tie attack directly. They minimize, they reduce, they silence, because confrontation creates headlines. Erasure feels cleaner, but here, what they miscalculated, you can AT erase something millions of people are actively watching. You can T-shrink influence that already expanded beyond the walls. You can bench a movement, and you definitely can. Scare players who are done pretending silence equals safety. What happened next? Wasn't it rebellion? It was awakening. And trust me, we were just getting started. The part nobody talks about isn't the bench. It's the meetings, what happens before the bench. It's the meetings, the subtle tone changes, the way feedback stops feeling like collaboration and starts feeling like correction. When you re-new and successful, you re-celebrated. When you re-new and influential, you re-evaluated. And when you re-influential and opinionated, that, when the temperature shifts, I've always been honest. In post-game interviews, in team discussions, in marketing conversations, if something didn't connect with real fans, I said it. If something felt outdated, and I asked why we were still doing it that way, not disrespectfully, not dramatically, just directly. But directness feels different depending on who receiving it. I started hearing phrases like, stay focused on basketball, or let leadership handle that, as if caring about how the game is presented somehow meant I was overstepping, as if players should generate the attention but not have a voice in how it's used. Let me ask something simple. If I am the one bringing a new generation of fans, shouldn't I be allowed to speak about what those fans respond to? That not rebellion, that investment. But behind closed doors, it started being framed differently. I was too visible, too independent, too comfortable challenging messaging. It wasn't to say about performance anymore. It was about influence. And influence is unpredictable. You can manage minutes, you can manage rotations, you can manage press access. It's harder to manage a player whose reach extends beyond the arena. The day my minutes quietly dropped, nobody gave me a basketball explanation. No film breakdown, no matchup discussion, just a vague, readjusting. When you lived in the gym your whole life, when something is about basketball, this was not that. I could feel the tension in practice. Teammates were in a hostile. They were confused. Coaches weren't aggressive. They were careful. Everyone felt like they were navigating around something that wasn't being said out loud. That the hardest part about institutional pressure, it is invisible. You can point to one villain. It's not one coach or one executive. It's a culture of subtle control, a culture where stepping outside of expected behavior creates quiet consequences. And here, the truth that scared people. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing for visibility. I wasn't pretending my platform didn't matter. And the more I stayed steady, the more uncomfortable that made certain rooms. Then the marketing tension rumors started leaking, stories that I questioned campaign directions, that I suggested leaning into authenticity over polished slogans, that I pushed for more player-driven storytelling instead of scripted messaging. None of that is controversial in modern sports. But when you challenge systems that have operated the same way for years, it feels threatening, especially when the person challenging them is 24, especially when that person is suddenly the face of the league biggest growth spike. Growth exposes cracks. And instead of addressing the cracks, sometimes institutions try to control the source of the spotlight. I could feel it building. The interviews got shorter. The media access got tighter. The messaging got colder. Nobody said, we need you to tone it down. They didn't have to. The silence said it. And the silence was strategic. And when Sophie started noticing patterns, she wasn't just reacting emotionally. She was watching behavior, watching how questions were dodged, watching how narratives were redirected. You don't sideline your biggest star unless you scared of her power. That wasn't often just support. That was diagnosis. Lexi saw it too. One of the smartest people in our locker room. When she said, if this can happen to Caitlin, what will they do to the rest of us? She wasn't being dramatic. She was being realistic. Because once influence becomes punishable, nobody is safe from quiet adjustments. And here, what leadership underestimated players talk across teams, across cities, across age groups. You can control press conferences. You can AT control private conversations. You can T control the way younger players feel when they see visibility get suppressed. And you definitely can T control fans once they sense manipulation. The hashtag explosion wasn't C random. Fans had receipts. They tracked minute patterns. They noticed social media posting shifts. They saw the energy change. Modern sports audiences are sharp. They don't trust the process without transparency. When the official statement dropped and didn't even mention my name, that A's when it stopped being subtle, because avoidance is loud, and players across the league felt it. This wasn't just about me sitting. It was about the message that sitting sent. Know your place. That what it felt like. And that never been wired to stay in places that shrink the game. Here, the part people misunderstand. I didn't want chaos. I wanted evolution. I didn't want power. I wanted progress. But sometimes progress threatens people who built their careers on control. And when control feels threatened, it tightens. It doesn't open up. The internal tension reached a point where silence started feeling heavier than speaking. That end when Sophie and Lexi stopped tiptoeing, not because they love drama, but because they love the league. And loving something sometimes means refusing to watch it eat itself. Inside meetings, conversations got sharper. You could feel the divide forming. Old school hierarchy versus modern player voice. Protect the brand versus empower the brand. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about a benching anymore. It was about identity. What kind of league do we want to be? One that fears influence or one that embraces it? Because here as the reality, you can build the future by silencing the present. And the longer this stretched, the more it stopped being about basketball. It became about whether player voices are assets or threats. It took hours. The second Sophie, quote, started circulating, the energy online flipped. This wasn't normal sports debate anymore. This wasn't psyching it, she should get more minutes chatter. It was coordinated, focused, relentless. Fans started pulling clips, not emotional edits, not dramatic montages, data, timelines, side-by-side breakdowns of my performance versus my playing time, screenshots of social media posts disappearing, engagement charts showing sharp drops the moment my presence decreased. People weren't guessing, they were analyzing. And when fans feel like something is being hidden from them, they don't calm down. They dig deeper. Hashtags multiplied. Not just where's Caitlin, but things like transparency now and let players lead. That, and when I realized this wasn't about one roster decision anymore, it was about trust. Trust between league and audience. And trust, once shaken, doesn't come back easily. Then something leadership probably didn't anticipate happened. Sponsors started getting tagged. Every brand connected to the league suddenly found themselves in comment sections filled with the same question. Do you support player voices? That pressure you can spin away with a vague statement. Because brands don't invest in controversy. They invest in momentum. And momentum was clearly shifting away from the league, A's control. Ticket conversations started surfacing. Fans posting screenshots of refunds. Others saying they wouldn't attend games unless clarity was given. Jersey sales data getting discussed in public threads. Money talks. And when money starts reacting, executives listen. But instead of immediate transparency, what came next was a carefully crafted corporate response. Vague language, strategic wording, zero accountability, the kind of statement designed to say something without actually saying anything. It labeled everything as rotational adjustments. That phrase spread like gasoline on a fire. Because if I was leading in production, if viewership spiked when I played, if arenas filled because I was in uniform, then rotational didn't make logical sense. Fans don't accept logic gaps anymore. And when Sophie reacted with nothing but an eye roll emoji, it spoke louder than a paragraph ever could. Lexi, follow-up post. So we re-pretending this is normal now, cut through the corporate tone instantly. That's D, when the narrative fully slipped. The league wasn't guiding the conversation anymore. The players were, and the fans amplified it. Meanwhile, inside locker rooms across the league, something deeper was brewing. You have to understand, younger players watch everything. They watch how influence is treated. They watch how honesty is received. They watch what happens when someone challenges leadership. And they calculate, is it safer to stay quiet? Or is it time to push? Private group chats lit up. Cross-team conversations that normally revolve around scouting reports suddenly centered on something bigger. Culture. Players who had stayed silent in the past began sharing stories, small ones at first. Times when interviews were redirected, moments where certain topics were discouraged, situations where messaging felt controlled instead of collaborative. None of it explosive on its own, but together it formed a pattern, and patterns scare institutions more than single incidents because patterns imply structure. The tension inside team facilities grew subtle but real. You could feel divisions forming, not between teammates personally, but between philosophies. There were veterans who believed in protecting the system, who felt public pushback could hurt long-term stability, and there were younger players who believed silence had already hurt progress enough. 2 generations, 2 approaches, 1 league, and the collision felt inevitable. What leadership likely expected was fatigue. They probably believed the outrage would cool, that social media attention would shift to the next headline. But something different happened. The conversation expanded. It wasn't just about me anymore. It became about how women's sports handled power. Commentators outside basketball started weighing in. Cultural analysts began asking whether fast-rising female athletes are supported or contained, whether influence is celebrated until it becomes inconvenient. The story grew bigger than any one player, and when a situation becomes symbolic, it stops being manageable. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't a fight about minutes. It was about visibility, about who gets to shape the narrative of the sport, and whether growth would be guided by player authenticity or executive comfort. Inside, I stayed steady. I kept training. I kept showing up. I didn't lash out. I didn't go on a media tour. Because sometimes restraint is louder than reaction, but the coalition forming around this issue, that was louder than anything I could have said alone. Sophie and Lexi had crossed the line most players are told never to approach, and instead of shrinking, they gained support. That changed the power dynamic. Because once players realize solidarity protects more than silence does, fear starts losing its grip. The league was no longer dealing with a single outspoken rookie. It was staring at a cultural shift. And cultural shift done in reverse, quietly. It was a leak. It wasn't even a viral clip. It was a chair, 2 chairs, actually side by side. Sophie on the left, Lexi on the right. No filters, no smiling PR rep standing off camera, no carefully written cue cards. Just 2 players staring straight into the lens like they were done pretending. And the first sentence Sophie said made the entire room freeze. If this is how you treat the player who helped build the momentum of this league, then no one is protected. She didn't to raise her voice. She didn't exaggerate. She just stated it. And when something true is spoken calmly, it hits harder. Lexi didn't hesitate either. We've been told to stay quiet before. That silence protects stability, but silence also protects dysfunction. That line spread faster than anything that had happened so far because it wasn't dramatic. It was direct. You have to understand what that meant inside professional sports culture. So there are unwritten rules. Don't question leadership publicly. Don't expose internal tension. Don't imply power imbalance. And in one interview, they broke all 3. They didn't dename executives. They didn't throw accusations recklessly. But they clearly described a culture where influence becomes uncomfortable once it grows beyond control. That when the tone shifted from controversy to confrontation, reporters in the room stopped interrupting. They let them talk, because everyone knew something significant was happening. Sophie leaned forward at one point and said something that didn't trend immediately, but it lingered. We don't need to be controlled, and we need to be supported. That sentence quietly reframed the entire debate. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about favoritism. It was about autonomy, about whether athletes who drive attention, revenue, and growth are treated as partners or assets. And when Lexi followed with, if visibility is punished, players will eventually stop wanting to shine. That landed even heavier because it touched something deeper, fear, not fear of being benched, fear of being contained. The interview ended without theatrics. No shouting, no tears, just clarity, but the aftermath, that was anything but calm. Within hours, clips were everywhere, not just sports pages, cultural commentary platforms, leadership podcasts, even business analysts discussing what this meant for modern athlete brand dynamics. Because suddenly this wasn't just about basketball. It was about power structures and emerging industries. NBA players reacted almost immediately. Some reposted the clips with simple captions like, respect. Others liked the video without comment, which in athlete culture is a message by itself. And then something subtle but powerful happened. Other WNBA players started interacting, not bold statements, but likes, reposts, quiet support. That kind of digital alignment speaks volumes in professional sports. It means you are not alone. Inside facilities across the league, conversations intensified. Players who had once stayed neutral were forced to decide. Do you align with leadership, silence, or with teammates demanding transparency? That tension didn't explode publicly, but it simmered. And when something simmers long enough, it reshapes the structure. What leadership underestimated was how coordinated this moment felt. It didn't feel like chaos. It felt deliberate, measured, unified. There was no anger in their tone. There was resolve. And resolve is more dangerous to institutions than outrage, because outrage fades, resolve organizes. Sponsorship executives reportedly began asking internal questions. Broadcasters requested clarity. Media departments suddenly had to answer harder inquiries. The pressure was no longer coming from anonymous accounts online. It was coming from respected athletes, established voices, and financial stakeholders. And here, what truly shifted the balance. So the narrative was no longer star versus league. It became players versus culture. That harder to dismiss because culture criticism requires reflection, not just rebuttal. For me personally, I stayed focused. I didn't jump into the interview cycle. I didn't tend fuel it publicly because sometimes leadership is shown not by speaking first, but by letting others speak when they choose to. And I respected what they were doing. It takes courage to risk comfort. It takes even more courage to risk career stability. But what Sophie and Lexi did wasn't too reckless. It was calculated. They weren't attacking the league. They were demanding evolution. And evolution always meets resistance before acceptance. Inside the league offices, meetings reportedly intensified. Damage control strategies were discussed. Messaging recalibrated. But here, as the reality leadership had to face, you can manage headlines. You can manage press releases. You cannot manage a unified locker room. And the coalition forming behind closed doors was no longer hypothetical. Players were talking, cross-team conversations were happening, younger athletes were watching closely. Veterans were reconsidering long-held assumptions. The league wasn't collapsing, but it was confronting itself. And when a system is forced to confront itself publicly, it either adapts or it fractures. It happened in conference rooms, quiet ones, glass walls, closed doors, phones on the table, legal teams present. Because when sponsors start asking questions, tone changes fast. Up until that moment, leadership could treat the situation like a media cycle. Ride it out, wait for the next headline, let attention drift. But when brand partners begin requesting clarification about organizational alignment and public perception, that SC corporate language for something very simple, fix this, or we reassess our investment. And that day when things shifted, because let us be honest about one reality most fans don't at. See, influence in modern sports is not controlled by press releases. It controlled by revenue flow, and revenue flow follows attention. Attention follows authenticity, and authenticity was not coming from official statements. It was coming from players, Clips from Sophie and Lexi interview didn't fade. They kept circulating. Analysts began dissecting tone, timing, and impact. Some praised their courage, others questioned the risk, but no one ignored it. Silence was no longer a viable strategy. Behind the scenes, reports suggested that emergency meetings were called. Messaging consultants brought in internal surveys distributed to players, not because outrage was loud, but because unity was visible. There, a difference. Outrage is noise. Unity is leverage. And once players begin operating collectively instead of individually, the power dynamic changes permanently. Suddenly, it wasn't about controlling one narrative. It was about managing trust. And trust, once shaken publicly, doesn't return with a memo. Inside locker rooms, something else happened. Conversations matured. This stopped being emotional and became strategic. Players weren't just venting, and they were evaluating, what do we want long term? What culture are we building? What protections need to exist for the next generation? Those are not rebellious questions, they are structural ones. And when athletes begin thinking structurally, leadership has two options: invite them into the architecture or brace for reconstruction without them. Sponsors reportedly began monitoring sentiment data. Engagement metrics were analyzed in real time. Comment sections weren't just comments anymore. They were indicators. Jersey sales, ticket projections, digital traffic, all connected to perception. And perception was drifting, not away from the league, but away from leadership credibility, that tatey nuance most people miss. Fans didn't want destruction. They wanted clarity. They wanted respect. They wanted alignment between the growth narrative and the treatment of the players, driving that growth. And that when internal conversations reportedly changed tone, instead of asking, how do we quiet this? The question became, how do we restore trust? Those are two very different objectives. One suppresses, the other evolves. What made this moment different from past controversies was timing. The league was expanding, new teams entering, audience growth accelerating, cultural momentum building, and momentum magnifies everything, including tension. You can T-cell progress publicly while appearing rigid privately. That contradiction collapses under scrutiny, and scrutiny was intense, not because people hated the league, but because they cared. Care generates pressure, and pressure, if handled correctly, produces growth. Handled incorrectly, it fractures alignment. The most powerful shift, though, did not come from sponsors. It came from the players themselves. You could feel it in interviews. The tone changed. Confidence sharpened. Even those who hadn't spoken directly began emphasizing themes of transparency, collaboration, and mutual respect in subtle ways. The language evolved. That is how culture shifts, not through confrontation alone, but through consistent signaling. And here, what leadership had to recognize, this wasn't about one player. It wasn't about one decision. It was about the future identity of the league. Would it be an institution that protects control, or one that embraces empowered athletes? Because modern sports does not revolve around silence anymore. It revolves around personality, connection, to voice. And when voice is perceived as threatened, audiences respond instinctively. The coalition forming behind closed doors was no longer hypothetical. It was organized, measured, calm, and that calm was the most unsettling part. Because chaos can be dismissed, calm conviction cannot. By the end of that week, the narrative had transformed. It wasn't a controversy. It was accountability, and that word carries weight. It doesn't imply rebellion. It implies responsibility. Leadership reportedly began discussing player councils with expanded influence, communication reforms, direct engagement sessions, not as reaction, as recalibration, because ignoring this moment would cost more long-term than addressing it honestly. The era of passive athletes was ending, and not in anger, in maturity, that what made this moment powerful. No screaming matches, no public meltdowns, just clarity. And clarity is difficult to argue against. For me personally, I stayed locked in, practiced, prepared, focused on the court, because visibility is strongest when performance matches principle. And the real statement isn't made in interviews. It team made when you step back onto the floor. The resolution did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with adjustments, quiet ones at first. Suddenly, the language in interviews changed. Leadership began emphasizing player collaboration. League officials started using words like alignment, transparency, and shared vision. Those weren't accidental shifts. That was recalibration. Because here is the truth. When pressure becomes unified instead of chaotic, institutions don't collapse. They evolve. Behind closed doors, structural conversations reportedly expanded. Player advisory voices gained more access. Communication channels that once felt filtered began opening slightly wider. Not because anyone lost control, but because control without trust is temporary, and trust had to be rebuilt. What changed everything was outrage. It was visibility. The world was watching. Sponsors were watching. Other leagues were watching. Even athletes in completely different sports were watching. And when your league is positioned as the future of women to SAS sports, you cannot afford to look like the past. The most important shift, though, wasn't external. It was internal. Players realized something powerful during this storm. They were not as replaceable as they had once been led to believe. That realization changes posture, it changes tone, it changes confidence. When athletes understand their collective value, ticket sales, digital engagement, cultural influence, they stop speaking from fear. They start speaking from awareness. And awareness is dangerous to outdated systems. But here, what most people misunderstood about this entire situation, this wasn't about tearing down the league. It was about protecting its future. Because if the WNBA is going to grow, really grow, it cannot be built on silence, hierarchy, and old politics. It has to be built on collaboration between talent and leadership. Modern fans don't. They just consume sports. They connect to personalities. They invest emotionally. They follow stories. And when they sense those stories are being controlled instead of celebrated, they push back. That pushback forced something important. Accountability conversations. Not dramatic ones, not viral ones, real ones. The kind where people sit down and say, how do we prevent this from happening again? Because here, as the reality, every league reaches moments like this. Moments where growth outpaces structure. Moments where influence becomes larger than the systems designed to contain it. The difference between stagnation and evolution is how leadership responds. In this case, the response wasn't immediate, it wasn't perfect, but it was necessary. Gradually, messaging aligned, visibility returned, engagement stabilized, but something fundamental had shifted forever. Players now understood their leverage, and leadership now understood that public trust is fragile. For me personally, through all of it, I stayed focused on the only thing I can control, the game. Because noise fades, performance doesn't. So when I step onto the court, that where the real statement is made, not through interviews, not through speculation, through execution, but off the court, there is a responsibility too. Responsibility to the fans who showed up, to the teammates who stood up, to the younger players watching all this unfold and learning what SD acceptable and what isn't. That bigger than one season, that legacy territory. And legacy isn't built by staying comfortable. It's built by navigating uncomfortable moments with clarity. The storm forced conversations that might have taken years. Otherwise, it accelerated growth, it exposed weak spots, it revealed who stands where, and in a strange way, that healthy, because transparency, even when messy, is stronger than silent resentment. Now, the league stands at a crossroads, not between chaos and control, between evolution and repetition. The fans have spoken, the players have spoken. The only question left is whether leadership listens long term. Because one thing is clear, the era of quiet compliance is over. This league is entering a new chapter, one defined by influence, unity, and visibility that cannot be erased. And whether you agree with how everything unfolded or not, you cannot deny one truth. Moments like this change institutions, not overnight, but permanently. If you rewatching this, you re part of that evolution too. So tell me, Do you think this moment strengthens the league long term, or did it expose cracks that still need repair? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want the real stories behind women and basketball, the ones nobody else is breaking down like this, make sure you resubscribed. Because the next chapter, IT's going to be even bigger.